All right, so welcome to another short lesson about making education better. All right, the purpose of today's demonstration, I guess, is probably the best word for it. Is just to run through a first day, second day, third day type of activity I would do with my students. I taught high school for almost 2 decades, and this is something I kind of developed over the years. And the last 4 or 5 years, I really didn't change it a whole lot because it seemed to be working the way it was. But it's something that I just kind of adjusted and adapted over the years to fit with the population I worked with. And this was an activity or a series of slides, discussions to set the tone for the class, to kind of get things going off on the right foot. So I'm not going to go through the entire discussion with y'all on this video like I would with my students. And what you're seeing is a 2-day activity discussion I would do with my high school students on the first 2 days of the term. Now, on classes that were multi-term, continuous or multi-term classes, I wouldn't necessarily just restart this, but I would occasionally revisit this from time to time with them. And I always started by a little bit of data collection. I think that you had to do that in all classrooms. It's not just a math thing. Although people have comments like, oh, you math people always collecting data. I was like, yes, but as educators, we should be collecting data. From day one, we should be assessing our students and what they know, what they can do, all those different pieces, because it's useful for us as educators to know what they need and what they want and how we can best serve them. That doesn't mean they don't want to learn math, so we're not going to teach math. No, that's not what I'm meaning. What I mean by that is that they want something along the lines of something that is applicable to them. So they have no interest in going into medicine. So all the discussions about medical needs might be rather pointless for discuss with them because they're like, I have no interest in that. That's what I'm meaning, is what are their actual interests and how does math plug into that? So, kind of go with the frame of mind of how does this fit in with the subject matter you're teaching your population. And that's some of the stuff that this is going to be kind of centered around. So I would start off every day with index cards at hand, make sure every student in the class had 2 index cards. My students were always in small groups, 3 or 4 students per group. And there'd be markers and crayons and colored pencils always in a little box in the center of the group. I did that on purpose. Yeah, it was a math class for me. It was high school, but for the most part, many people never really go beyond their interest, desire for lots of colorful events. And if you think about the world around us, it's not monotone. So it's not growing up. Oh, growing up, we just switch over to pens and pencils. Well, not always. Some of us still really appreciate color, although monotone can be nice and clean often. So they're both sides of that. Okay, so those would be the supplies the very first day. There's nothing that I expect them to walk in with, but these are the things I'd be expecting to give them as they came in the room with. And on one side of this, I would put this, of course, this is everything I'm showing you is what would be in the front of my room. I'm doing a PowerPoint presentation. I always had access to the last decade and a half, especially I had access to an LCD projector, and I would use this on an everyday occurrence and it helped the classroom management quite a bit. For a number of different reasons. One of which is I had the ability to put the information up on the board and watch students and see their interactions so I could observe them more instead of writing stuff and they write stuff and neither of us are really looking at each other. This gives me the ability to observe them a little bit and how that process worked. And I would collect this information, phone numbers and email addresses from them and about their parents or guardians. And I did that for a number of different reasons. Within our computer systems at the district I worked in, the phone numbers and the email addresses were often wrong. And that was in spite of the efforts, very good efforts that most of the administration team went through to collect good data from those people. And it just happened to be it doesn't always up to date. Things can change at the last minute. Sometimes a parent puts down wrong information purposefully or accidentally. So just getting a second viewpoint on that information is very helpful. And then 3 neat things. And really the reason I did that 3 neat things more than anything else was to get to know those students, to give them input into who they were so they can kind of self-identify themselves a little bit about what's interesting about them. And then also the other piece of that was it helped me get to know them. I'd have 150 new students every August, every January. And this was a way for me to get to identify name and face rather quickly. I could sit through that index card because on the back of this index card, I always had them draw a self-portrait. And some students would draw things like a football or a stick figure, but they always, in some form or fashion, really did represent who they were. And that was what was important. And I always drew them a self-portrait of myself so they could see what I was talking about. Mine was always a stick figure. It was the same thing for every year. Anyway, and then I'd have them run through a couple surveys, and one of the things that this did for me was it let me know who didn't and did not have access to this technology. If no one in the classroom pulled out a phone to do this activity, it told me a lot. If everybody pulled out a phone or a laptop to do this activity, that told me a whole something else. So it kind of gave me a good gauge of what I could and couldn't do in the classroom based upon that stuff. The last couple of years I taught, we were in a one-to-one district, so every student in the room had a Chromebook or they had their own device. So that worked out well too. And then I had another one, had a couple different forms. And one of the things this did was this allowed me to collect the index cards while they completed these surveys, both of these surveys. One of them was just a little bit more like a name, phone number, that type of stuff. And it was in digital format. So essentially it was the index card in digital format. And that gave me a spreadsheet. The other one was a physical card so that I could kind of carry that around if I needed to as the school year went on. And then this was some background about their experiences in mathematics. I don't know if any of these links are still alive because this is from the time I worked in a district that I no longer am associated with. So these links have probably been shut down and no longer work. I'm not sure. But the idea is that I would find out a little bit about their dispositions about the math class. So if everybody in the class was fearful of math, well, then that kind of gave me some pretty good indication. If everybody loved math, that meant that I could do different things with that class. So then I'd move on and I'd start by just simply talking about attitudes. Notice that we really haven't talked about math a whole lot at this point. At this point, I'd probably be about 30 minutes into the first class session, and we haven't really mentioned math a whole lot because before I'd get to anything else, I'd go through this discussion, and I would have these discussions with the students about why are we here? What are we doing here? What are the things that we want to get out of this session? What are the things that we want to do here? And I'd always have a student say, I just want to get a grade. I want to get out of here. I don't like math. And that's fine. I said, but there's a more enjoyable way to do this. Can you try to put yourself out there for a little bit and try to find some aspect of this that's interesting you? Give me a shot at helping you, and it always worked out decently well. It didn't work out 100% of the time. I didn't have 100% success with every single student, but I think that it made an impact when we start talking to the students and start investing and getting them to invest into their own process and education. And then I'd start off with just saying, I have 3 rules, right? And I'd run through these 3 rules with my students: respect, responsibility, and self-reliance. And then we'd have this big discussion about what each of these mean, right? And how they look like or what they look like in this classroom. And I do mean how and what. Those are 2 different aspects of that. What does respect look like? How do you respect yourself, the classroom, your classmates, and the teacher in the front of the room? And then we just go through that exact same discussion about responsibility and self-reliance. And of course, people always think that self-reliance is knowing, being able to do everything on your own, which I think is a horrible definition of self-reliance. Self-reliance is knowing when you need to ask for help, and also knowing when you can do stuff on your own and you can do stuff without being prompted to. It's the idea that my wife knows that if I see a sink full of dishes, I'm going to go load the dishwasher or clean the dishes instead of waiting for her to ask me to want to go do the dishes. And there are times when I say, hey, what do you need me to do when I get home? And she says, I need the dishwasher done, or I need the dishes cleaned. It's like, okay, that's what I'm going to go do. At other times I say, what do you need me to do? She says, oh, nothing. We're just hanging out for right now. And that's fine too, because it's a matter of addressing what needs to be done, right? But at the same time, there's this attitude of, I know that I can go do this thing, or I'm going to go do this thing without being asked. And that's one of the things I really drove after with the students, is this idea that I shouldn't have to come around and ask you day after day after day after day to start your work. That should be just kind of a thing. You kind of acknowledge or understand that this is something you're going to do, right? And this whole discussion led us to a place where we would thus talk about self-reliance is the only classroom rule, and how self-reliance involved respect and responsibility to oneself, to the space, to the other people in the room. And if you're being self-reliant, then you're doing all these other things as well. And that's maybe a little bit of a stretch to some people, but it worked in my space. And a lot of students like the idea of there only being one rule. I just have to be sure that I'm doing what I'm supposed to be doing, and then we go from there. Now, with that said, I almost always came up with a couple extra rules as the semester goes on. I'd tell the students, like, these are my rules. Any other rules that come into this space are a result of your behavior. So, for instance, one semester I had to institute a rule that said no throwing sandwiches across the room because someone threw a sandwich across the room, right? And I said the idea here is that's not being responsible. That's not being respectful. That's not the thing. You just ruined a sandwich. You also hit somebody in the face with a sandwich. That doesn't make any sense, right? So I jokingly say, well, we have a rule now that says you can't throw sandwiches across the room. But ultimately, the issue there is that you're not being respectful of yourself, you're not being respectful of the classroom, and you're not being respectful of the space. And I would have that discussion with the student with the other students present. And like, a lot of people say, well, I'm going to pull that person out in the hallways. No, let's have that conversation as a group and discuss why this isn't appropriate and why it affects the whole class. And I would actually stop the classroom and stop teaching in 15, 20 minutes and go through this entire process and talk about why that is. It's a big, giant life lesson, if you will. And people say, well, you're wasting all this time talking about this. No, I'm investing in our future by talking about this now and getting this cleared up. Instead of just kind of putting a Band-Aid on this and hoping it goes away, let's fix the problem. Let's just stop what we're doing. Let's discuss the issue. Let's address the issue and talk about what this really should be. And that would work a lot more. And I'd always go back to my 3 rules: respect, responsibility, and self-reliance, and how respect and responsibility are embedded in being self-reliant. And a lot of students, especially this modern generation, really grabs a hold of that very well. And then if you're not familiar with this is something you should probably go look. I just grabbed this as an image off of Google, the 5S policy, or the 5S 5 Sigma. There's lots of different names for it. It has really interesting roots. If you want to go research what that is, it was originally rooted out of Detroit. And it went over to Japan, went through some refinement, and then came back to the United States after that. And the idea is sort, stabilize, scrub, straighten, and sustain. These are not the exact words in the original use, but that was the main purpose of this. Is the idea is let's do things so that the people that come after us can use this space. So let's do things in such a way that when we come back the next day, we can use this space. But let's always take care of these different pieces as we go through this. And I would go through and explain this process with the students. If you've never been through 5S training, I really encourage you to do that because I think it's extremely helpful with maintaining a good classroom, especially if you have lots of technology and other devices you use. I always had lots of toys, mathematical toys in my classroom that we use for teaching purposes and learning purposes. And it was great because then the students understood this is part of the process that we go through, this sorting process. And keep in mind that this is what I'm going through here with this discussion. At this point in the video, we're talking 13 minutes in. At this point in my classroom discussion, depending on the group, this would be anywhere between 45 minutes and 90 minutes into the class of this discussion I'd had with them, because there would be a lot of questions, a lot of pieces, and I'd go through sort. What does sort look like? What does straighten look like? What does scrub, stabilize, sustain? What do they look like? I'd go through each one of those things, and I even had some other activities at occasion with the right group. I'd have kind of standing off to the edge, like a Raza square. For anybody that's familiar with drama, a Raza square is you put a word, an emotion or a character trait on a piece of paper, a big piece of paper, and you have everybody write down what you would say to somebody that had that. Like, so for instance, integrity, right? What would you say to someone who had integrity? And then you put somebody on the square and everybody says those phrases to that individual who has integrity. And that person in the center square hears all these phrases. So you have a classroom of 30 people. They just heard 30 people tell them that they have integrity. And that person starts to feel what integrity is supposed to feel like. And it makes a big impact. So I'd even do those types of things with the different populations. So what we're looking at here is a 2 to 3 day activity I would do with my students at the beginning of the term before I do any math. And I wouldn't just jump straight into math. With my calculus crew, I'd jump straight into math. But with the other classes, I wouldn't do that. At this point in the class, anywhere between 45 minutes in to 90 minutes into the semester with them. And then I'd go through the second note card. Remember that first sheet said you need 2 note cards. The second note card, which is optional, was go through this idea of setting up a study group with them. So my students would already be in a small group, 3 to 4 students. They were not required to keep that as their study group. They could meet with anybody as their study group. And I had students do this every single year. I always gave them a grade if they could have an adult sign off that they were meeting on a regular basis, once or twice a week as a group, and doing their study group for my class. I would give them an additional assessment grade, essentially another test grade on their exams, or another exam grade, essentially what it came down to. And I'd go through this process with them, talking about what this needs to look like, what are good group norms, and we'd go through that entire process. And I'd strongly encourage them to do that. Now, that would be once per 9 weeks, they would get a grade for that. The students who did it always did better. Imagine that, right? And I'd say this could be done in lots of different ways, but just meet with your classmates, right? And then more about the study groups, setting that up. If you want to pause this and read through this a little bit, you can do that. And I'm just kind of moving through for the sake of time. This particular set of slides was for pre-calculus. All my classes had textbooks originally, and then by the time I left that district, the equivalent of Algebra 1, Algebra 2, and Geometry didn't have textbooks. All our materials were virtual and were posted into Canvas, and Google were the 2 places that was posted for. So we'd go through what those processes looked like. And then I'd go through some other pieces, like I don't know how many of you know about the great multitasking myth. There's some information out there. It actually causes brain damage. I'll let you read through that. I'd talk about this with the students. And that also start giving them some background about why math. So here we are talking about math for the first time, right? But why math? The reason, some reasonings behind this. And this is pretty old data at this point. This is about 10 years old at this point, maybe 15. This was before the production of the first iPhone. This is the why Apple chose to produce the iPhones in China rather than the United States. There were 3 major places that were competing for the iPhone production facilities. A place in China, Austin, Texas, and I forget the third, but the third place was in the United States as well. It seems like it was in Florida or something like that. And China won out, and it had to do with a time to first production event, and it was sheer numbers. So I use this to talk about why math is important, and it's because the reason Apple went that way was because China had the trained manpower to do it fast enough for them. It wasn't that we're incapable of it. It was just simply because they had the number of people trained in what they needed done in a very, very short period of time. It took them 15 days. They already had the people trained to do it. In the United States, the idea is that we need people doing the same thing here in the United States, just being trained up to do those things. And then we go through what is math, and I always get you can pause and do this as well. What is mathematics? And mathematics is, and people give all sorts of answers, and then here's the real answer. And I'd go through that process with them as well. And then here's a big one, and this always had a huge impact with certain populations that I taught, was this idea that if you look at the far right column of far right column there, Euro-Renaissance era, you're talking about that mathematics in Europe is only within the last 500 years or so has any major contributions. Mathematics at its origins can be traced back to Egypt, India, and China. The Americans, the Mayans, and the Incas were actually producing mathematics as much as 2,500 years ago. And that is really powerful when you think that every major power in history had mathematics associated with its greatness. There are other things that go along with that as well, but it kind of is an eye-opener for a lot of people when they've realized, Europeans weren't the only ones that produced math. In fact, the reason why the Europeans were able to produce math is because so many other groups had already produced so much other math. which is interesting to have a big discussion about that and recenters and talking about perspectives. And if you flip the world on upside down, literally what it looks like. And I just kind of go through different ideas, and I'm kind of speeding through this stuff just so that you kind of get a feel for what I run through the first few days with my students in high school, to kind of give them some background of why we care about mathematics. We go through some mathematical history stuff. And all this stuff is documented. I'm not making any of this up. Some people think that, like they had the first, Babylonians had the first batteries. Yep, they sure did. Years and years and years ago. You can see the dates up there at the top. And then, of course, we have our Erich Muntering numbering system. There we go, right? And it's based upon the number of angles each symbol has. So the number 1 has 1 angle, so it's the number 1. Number 2 has 2 angles, so it's the number 2, and on so on down the line. And of course, 0 has 0 angles in it, right? And then, we keep going on talking about some others. Sometimes I skip over some of the stuff depending on the population. If you've never been here and you're a math person, you might want to check out your genealogy and check out your advisor, and you can trace back your genealogy, mathematical genealogy, to point of origins practically sometimes. And then I gave them the first 2 assignments, and that was the day. So sometimes this would take as much as 3 days depending on the crew. So if I had freshmen, I'd spend a lot of time developing these different pieces and going through these different ideas with the students. It might take 3 days. With my calculus crew, it would take maybe a day and a half with them, because the questions would be less. They were already a little bit more familiar. They were already a little bit more set. They were older students. They understood a little bit more of this. And of course, at the university level, I can go through this entire set of slides here in about 30-40 minutes. So think about your population. Think about what they need, what reflects the subject matter you're teaching, and how you can use those different pieces. And I strongly encourage you, when you start doing this, to keep your classroom setup as simple as possible. Like I talked about my classroom rules. I don't really believe in tons and tons of rules. We have these overarching ideas, and from a biblical perspective, God told us all these different things, like don't do this, don't do that, don't do this. He listed off an entire group of animals that weren't kosher, right? So these animals that we're not supposed to eat, and you can say, well, we don't follow those rules anymore. Well, I do, and I am a follower of the Messiah, but I also follow those kosher rules. And he didn't list out every single animal that we're not supposed to eat, but he listed off animal types that we weren't supposed to eat. And that kind of the same idea of this overarching behavior of what it's supposed to look like. And I think that when we take that perspective on teaching of these overarching ideas with particular instances and examples, makes a lot more powerful impact than trying to address every single little behavior. Think about how that behavior reflects and does this other thing. So anyway, I hope that helps and is useful. Think about how you're going to set up your classroom and how you're going to manage your classroom, what you can do. And there's lots of other resources out there available as well. Take care.